Good morning. My name is Bill Pollack, and we're at the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles. It's April 2001. My guests today are Walker Edmiston on my right and Bill Molle on my left, and these are two people from our fabulous 50s era.
Yeah.
And they got a lot to tell us. So we'll turn the meeting over to these two fine gentlemen and hear what they have to say.
Well, good morning to one and all. This is my friend Bill. We've been racing together off and on for a lot of years, but we started back then, before they were classics. They were just the cars we started, but I started as a kid. I was, my mother was one of the first women drivers in the United States. She said when they pulled up to a corner, a man would tip his hat and tell her to go on. When they drove Hudsons, because my uncle was Will Carter Carburetor. And he used to test the carburetors. So my mother, little known, is one of the only women in the United States in the early years to have ever driven the Indianapolis track when it was brick. He used to go there to test the carburetors. And he had these old Hudson test chassis with boards out on the side, and he would lay there while she drove around, and he would be metering and working on these old carburetors. So that kind of got me started. And then my cousin, he was one of the brown boots, bat wing kind of heroes, and he drove dirt track and midgets. And that was the most glorious thing, to go over to Cahokia, Illinois and everything, and sit up in the stands and have the ground vibrate as they come down to go into those turns. So for a little kid who would ride home in the back of the seat of the Plymouth with his helmet on, that kind of gets you started a little bit. So that's kind of where my beginnings started. So where did yours start, Bill?
I guess mine really started with the Soapbox Derby groups. We ran the Soapbox Derby on Slauson Boulevard up near Overhill Drive in Leimert Park in those days. And a fellow came along named Fred Frame. And he was introduced to me. I was just a kid, but he was an Indianapolis winner. And he started telling me, he says, "You look like you got a pretty good car here, but let me give you some pointers," which he did. And I won the Soapbox Derby at that time. But then down the street from me, there was a fellow named Bruce Brahmy, father. And in his back garage, he built speedway cars. And his son, who is a few years older than I am, worked in the garage there with her. And of course, Bruce Brahmy Sr. and Jr. were famous IndyCar builders and had quite a reputation. And then my next thing, I was able to get $100 together, and I got a 29A and bought a Rajo head, and we went to Muroc, and I joined the 90 mile an hour club. Well, 90 miles an hour at that time was a lot of miles per hour. And then, of course, that was a great time out there at Muroc, and then the war came along, of course. And after the war, of course, I was in the Navy, and I was told by somebody about all the wonderful girls around these sports car tracks. I thought, gee, that looks pretty good.
Uh-huh.
So I went to a race at Santa Barbara, and I saw some nice things, cars and girls. And then decided to take my 56 Thunderbird tubeless tires to Paramount Ranch, which amused everybody.
That's when I first saw Bill.
That was where we met.
There was a fellow named Perry Perron, and all the guys, because we were sort of the extras, the backup for the race car drivers that came in, and boy, they had muscle and loud, and ours went, and so we were these backup guys. And my wife and Evelyn and I were there, and all of a sudden, here comes the cars around, and there's some Corvettes. Remember Corvettes that used to come around and leave plastic on the track that you had to dodge when they hit one another? There was a green Thunderbird and somebody driving it, and I mean green apple green, not British racing green, but green, and this policeman's helmet. And it came around, and you remember Thunderbirds? The early ones, they leaned. And you could kind of look up under part of the chassis as he'd come around the turn, and he was driving his heart out. I think it had white wall tires. But anyway, that's when I first met Bill. So,
And at that race is when I saw this guy, Perry Perrone. And he wanted to sell his car because it was a Panhard, two-cylinder Panhard. And he said that the Crosleys were here to stay and he couldn't run with them anymore. So I bought the Panhard, $2,500.
well,
Yeah.
see, one of the things was Perry and I, he was head of the the inspection program, and the guys that inspected the cars and all of that kind of stuff. And we'd raced quite a few races. Panhard had 2 cylinders. Crosley had 4 cylinders, and you could really pump them out. You could bore them 60 over, and they would go, and a light car. So this was, the second or third Riverside race, because I had raced the first one and all of them. But anyway, I kind of wiped him out in his Panhard. The Crosley. And if you've watched Formula One races now, you know how you come into a turn and they do that? Well, Perry got very upset because I was taking the short line through the turns, and the 8mm movies we have, he's about 10 car lengths behind me anyway. And so I'm going through the S curves and up through 1 and around 6 and 9. And Perry protested me for cutting him off in the turns, but luckily we had 8mm movies to show that he was so far behind me. So I think that's one reason why he decided to sell the Panhard. And he never bent the floorboards driving it anyway. So.
But with the Panhard, I got Jerry Fairchild.
Well, yes.
See, the world's greatest mechanic. And he had an idea to fuel inject, because we didn't have fuel injection in those days. We had carburetors and Webers and that sort of thing. And, so Jerry wanted to go. I said, go. So we built a fuel injection system from a Goliath, and with a Bosch plenum chamber, and put it on there. From then on, nobody could get near me. I ran away with all the races and won the Pacific Coast Championship 3 or 4 times, and it was off to the races. But then with the fuel injection, these crazy Frenchmen came over, and they wanted to see the fuel injection. They were from Panhard and Deutsche Bonnet, which was basically a Panhard. And so they wanted Jerry and I to go to France and run the Le Mans Index race and give them the fuel injection system. And after many hours of negotiation, we decided not to go. And we backed out of it. So we built that. But then we built a 4-cam Panhard engine, which had a big cam section up here. Each valve had its own cam. That was so terrifying that you could go down the line, just pass everybody off the line. But when you get down to the slow speed, the cam was designed wrong, and you couldn't go through the turn. Couldn't go slow. Could only go fast. So we scrapped that idea. Then I got the idea I should have a Lotus. Well, Steve McQueen and I had become pretty good friends by that time. We'd traded mechanics and did work with each other. So I was doing his dental work. So he had to quit racing at that time because of the studio contracts. So I traded him some dentistry for his Lotus 11. And that was a beautiful car. I've got some good pictures of that. And I drove the Lotus 11 until I did well with it, good with it, until one night we ran an oval race at Riverside. Well, the oval race at night was a little different. We made it was a left oval and under the lights. And I was running third, and there was 3 of us. Up on turn 9 would be one end of the oval. there was some oil appeared. So the next time we came around, all three of us went high, but another guy running fourth thought that easy picking, so he drove in underneath, lost it in the oil, and I cut him in half and went through the guardrail.
That's when you stuff the whole front of the
Yes,
Notice 11 almost to the windshield.
Right.
And you're sitting there. And of course, now, he didn't mention that a good majority of the sports car drivers that had been driving were all up in the stands. We were watching these guys who wanted to run the oval at night, you see.
Yeah.
So all of us were sitting there with bated breath waiting to see if he's going to move.
Well, that wasn't the climax of
Yeah.
it. The climax
Right.
was that after gathering up the bits and pieces, I went over and had coffee with Mary Hauser. It was cool and calm, put the crap on the trailer, and then I walked across the infield to see if I could find a few more bits and pieces, and here was this driver of the number 4 car. His name was Dave Kite. Well, we didn't know him. He was from up north, which was a bad word to begin with. And so I walked up and I said, "Aren't you Dave Kite?" And he said, "Yeah." Whang! I got him. And he went down, and the crowd went crazy.
Oh, yeah, everybody was yelling
That
and
was
cheering and everything.
So that, of course, caused me to appear before the contest board in a week or so later. Well, it happened to be at a night that I was lieutenant commander at the time. And so I thought it would be a little fun. So that was the time of the Cane Mutiny. So I got some steel balls. And I went before the contest board, and it was Kenny Miles and Belichowski and Frank Moniz. They were all on the board, stern and severe, because I was obviously a hothead that would do that. And so I sat there clicking the balls, and I said, "Well, you see, I really wasn't mad. I only thought it was the just thing to do." Kept clicking the balls, and they all broke up and said, "Get out of here." And I was absolved of the problem. That was pretty a funny affair.
Well, yeah. Well, mine still goes back to the childhood days. I have a picture, I'll tell you about the midget racing later, but back then with my cousin racing sprinters and midgets, I built my own midget race car. And I've got pictures of it. It looked pretty good. And back in St. Louis, Missouri, we lived on a pretty steep hill. So I would take some cardboard boxes and things and pile them out in the street, and then kids would help me push the midget up. It was like a soapbox racer, except it looked like a midget. And then I'd come roaring down and hit those boxes, and they'd go all in all directions, except the day my mother was coming home from the market and saw it happen. And that was kind of the end of that kind of adventure. So, but then in growing up, my cousin also built these race cars. In those days, we had junkyards, not breaking yards or hidden behind walls, but a few blocks away, they had a garage at the end where they built. And they had two-man cars back in the early 30s when I was a child. And he would come by and pick me up, so I got to ride in that seat that's kind of behind the shoulder of the driver when he would go out and drive and test these two-man cars before the single-seaters started coming out. So you can see that started the adrenaline going. So then as we moved on and I came to California, and I've been in show business. I'm an alleged actor and voice man and all of that. So that was my career as acting. And people said, oh, I should have been in automobiles. But finally out here, I got involved in sports cars. And I've had some doozers, not a doozy.
Some of the best that are in the museum here now.
Well, I had the Fagoni Fallaci Talbot coupe with the front wheel skirts that I used to drive to work at KTLA. And they would let me park it under one of the covers there so it wouldn't sit in the sun when I did my TV show. And I had Roger Barlow's Talbot, Fagoni Fallaci Talbot drop head that he actually raced in one of the earliest races out here. And I bought that at one of the auctions. And, I've had one of the 3 Arnold Bristol coupes. And I've had some pretty good cars, Mercedes 300 SLs and things. But then, and the greatest of all, I mean, if you ever get a chance, you've got to have one. You've got to get one of these, friends. You've got to have a three-wheel Morgan. Now, I've seen pictures in some of the old English magazines of these cars in trials and everything, and you think, well, there's the front wheels, like here, and the headlights, but there's no back wheels. Where are they? They kind of Well, you find out there's only one back wheel, and it's a motorcycle, and they built them in England. And they came with Japs and Anzanis and matchless engines. And the first one I had was a Ford 10 that I got out of Phoenix, Arizona, that a guy had brought over in the belly of a bomber from England. But the funniest thing is the one with the outside engine and the rocker arms going, and you're driving it.
That's what mine was, the
Yeah,
matchless.
you're driving it in the rain, and the steam is hitting those, and you're in this little windshield, and you got your glasses on, which are buffeting, but there's no foot pedal. You see, you have no accelerator. It's a thumb throttle up here on the steering wheel, and you have a 3-speed or a 2-speed, depending on the model. Some had low and go, and so that was an adventure. I've had three of those, and then the 4-wheel Morgans. I've had 4-wheel Morgans and 4-seaters, but those are real classics. They ride like a rock. And so through all of that experience with those cars, and finally sports car racing comes along, and there's a lot of guys that kind of got the itch because the police liked the Fagoni Fallaci Talbot one night. Hot rods were the big thing. Guys like Max Belichowski, who became famous later with the Old Yellers, these were famous hot rodders. We'd go out on Sepulveda, or they would. So one night I took this 1939 Fagoni Fallaci Talbot coupe. And what's that? Well, it's teardrop shaped and had front wheel skirts. And I got in line, and I think I turned like 95 miles an hour. It was a 6-cylinder. And that kind of bit me. I kind of liked that idea without police being on the back of me. So I looked around, and we went to one of the early kind of minor sports car get-togethers and racing at an airport. And I think, got to do that. So I bought a Miller Crosley, basically. A fellow named Miller built these little Crosleys, and had a Crosley engine in it, and it went pretty good for a stock car. And I took it to Willow Springs for the first race, the very first race at Willow Springs out yonder. You go out, the 14?
Yeah.
Yeah, out there to the end and turn left and go somewhere, and there's the track. And it was great in those days because there was nothing there, nobody, nowhere, just all of that going on. So I took the Crosley. Now it's stock, and it's got a little toy carburetor, a little toy engine and everything, and they did about 75, 80 miles an hour stock. They won index of performance at Le Mans. So I got out in that in the early race, and I don't know if they were, 20-minute races or not very long. But anyway, I'm going around pretty good, and all of a sudden, there's no lower. If I take my foot off, it dies. If I put my foot flat on the floor, it goes. And then suddenly the accelerator's not working. It came loose, and later on, back in the pits, you've heard of those in racing when you're in the pits. That's race talk. You get back there, and we took the bonnet hood off, and the carburetor was hanging by one screw. One screw is holding the four little, and it's hanging there, and the cable had come off. So I finished the last 2 or 3 laps like the World War I pilots with the key. I'd turn it on, and it would go, turn it off, and it'd slow down. So I managed to finish the race, so I finished. But that was exciting, and then we decided, let's make a race car. So I got together with a friend, and we really did a number with Turner Racing pistons and sodium valves and Winfield boat racing cam, and stripped that thing down and aluminum hood or aluminium. No, it's American, aluminum hood, and aluminum doors and everything. And that car turned out to be pretty fast little car. But, well, we'll tell about that with the Panhard and the Ferry Renault. That comes a little later.
Yeah, that's a good story in itself. The famous Ferry Renault, which is a racing car, streamliner, the fastest Class H car in the world, brought over here to show us yokels how to do it.
Dr. Ferry Porsche's son, or Dr. Porsche's son, designed this.
Yeah. And Walker, you beat him by a tenth of a second?
6/100ths of a second or so, the width of a headlight. But they said it couldn't be beaten. In fact, at one of the dinners once we had a get-together, and I was quoting Road and Track magazine, the authority in all of this. Road and Track magazine says the new 750 Renault that had won Index of Performance at Le Mans, we call it Le Mans, Le Mans, that's race car talk. And so it couldn't be beaten. And it said the car is reported to have been pushed up to 90 miles an hour. And I was reading that and I said, yes, it was pushed up to 90 miles an hour and it still wouldn't start. But Jim Parkinson, another one of our buddies, Jim Parkinson was driving it. And my wife took wind-up home 8mm movies, and this was at Paramount Ranch. And for the entire race, neither one of us...
Pomona.
Pomona, yeah.
Pomona for that.
Neither one of us ever led a lap. But the other guys, they just... Because we had laid out one race to go through the car. We were out after this Renault. So we laid out the previous race.
That's before my fuel injection, of course.
Yeah, that was before you. That's before you
Yeah.
got involved in it.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, there were the Verrecchio brothers and all the Class H and Class G guys had we were in the front line. And so it was a pretty exciting race for the crowd chasers, as we were called in those days. But I managed to beat the fabulous Ferry Renault, and I understand they shipped it back to France.
They took it back, yeah, it went home.
But the Crosley only weighed like 70 pounds, and we had stripped it down so complete. But that Renault,
And that weighed about 1,800 pounds.
But you had to carry a spare tire, and the Renault behind the head had a headrest that was curved right down to the back of the cockpit, right to the driver's head. You lift the headrest, the spare tire was sitting upright under there to use as a roll bar. I mean, it was a beauty. We've all kind of looked for it through the years, nobody can find it. But that was one of the adventures of the early days. And then after that, then I started moving into real more like race cars. I got an Elva Mark IV with a Coventry Climax Stage 4 in it, which would run with the Lotuses and the
slow.
Lolas, yeah. So, but that's when I started moving.
Didn't I tap you up at Las Vegas?
Yes, we were running as a team.
You tried to cut in front of me, and I tapped you, and you went out.
No, I had the line. You tried to come in underneath.
No. You just didn't know how to handle
You ever watch
the car.
Schumacher? You see, as I come in, and I was ahead, and all of a sudden I got this nudge, like somebody put his finger on my shoulder, and he's pushing, and all of a sudden I go, wuzza, and there go about 20 cars, including his. And I had these big tire marks on the back of it. But luckily, I never had any high adventure, though. As I say, we were not the big timers with the big names, because we used to tow them in behind our car and stuff. And then some young kid named Lance Reventlow came in with a big van and ramps and a car with ramps, and they let it down, and you say, what's that? We're in trouble. And then pretty soon, muscle started coming in, and eventually I had to have one of those, an Allard, a man named Sidney Allard, over in England. He built
the world's worst car.
But boy, did he build hot rods. They were allegedly I mean, they were very much like an American hot rod. They were a chassis and an aluminum body and sickle fenders and the biggest, hairiest Cadillac, Chrysler, whatever you wanted to stuff in it. And they did okay. Yeah, and so finally I had to have one of those. So I traded the Elva Mark IV to a guy who had the Allard, and I think he downshifted the 53 Cadillac engine at about 80 miles an hour. And the rods needed some air, so they went through the side of the block to get a little breathing room. And you get rattle, 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 rattle. So he traded me this car, and I took it, and the guys looked at it, and they said, "Do you know what you bought?" And I said, "Well, let's get another engine." He said, "No, we'll fix this one." And I said, "What?" "Yeah." They welded a plate on the side of the engine, put a sleeve in it, and about 2 days later, it's ready to go. Fire it up. Let's go. Vroom. There it went. So we didn't change the engine. Same engine, 53 Cat. But
ill handling.
Well, yeah, at San Diego, what was in the parking lot of San Diego?
Yeah, Del Mar.
Del Mar, yeah. Boll Pollack says we're supposed to use all the names and dates of the races. We were driving. Who remembers names and dates? So, anyway, I'm on the line here, and next to me is two Testarossa Ferraris. Morganson out of Arizona and Josie von Neumann, woman driver. Wow.
Oh, she's the one that screwed me with my Allard.
Oh.
She told me the tires were wrong, that I should use her husband's Engelbert tires.
Well, I had Engelbert's on.
Yeah, and I took it down there, and see, there's 9 turns on that course.
Yeah.
I spun on 9 turns.
Well, I spun in the first turn. They dropped the flag. Well, a Cadillac with a Lincoln gearbox next to the two Ferraris. The Ferraris, they have to get ready like a prize fighter, and they're sitting there, and they're revving up, and you're getting chains rattling and things going on in the Ferrari. And the guy drops the flag, and the Allard's gone. Don't hit the table, because it shakes the microphone. I'm awfully sorry about that. And so, anyway, the Allard leaped about 2 car lengths in front of these Ferraris, and we went into turn 1, and the Allard properly spun around because the tail just came right out on me. Wuzza, 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 wuzza. I put it in gear and caught both Ferraris before the next turn and passed them and went into the next turn and didn't spin it. But what I was doing, I had my elbows up, and Allards, if you're not really familiar with them, they had a solid front axle that wasn't. They cut it and put a plate on each side and put pins in there so the front end would go up and down like that for trials. And you go into the turn, well, the front end's doing this. So if you put your elbows up and you go like that, they think you're totally out of control. And Josie von Neumann was behind me in the Ferrari, and she wanted to eat this thing, and I'm going like this with my elbows up in the air. And she said, "I didn't know where you were going to be. I could have passed you. You were using the whole track." Because Allards walked on you too. You'd go into a turn and it would walk about 3 feet. But anyway, what a great car. And that was racing. I mean, take your Formula One and all of that. That was racing. And in later years, if we get to it, I'll tell you about when I was midget racing, dirt track midget racing. But when I started this, and Cal Nide and a lot of the race car drivers, when they said, you drove sports cars. And I said, yes. And they said, "Oh, well then you've never driven a real race car before, have you?" I said, "Do you ever drive an Allard?" That's pretty close to a dirt car. But anyway, that's some of the adventures.
Yeah, those were great days, but you never got in any fights. See, I like to
No, I'm a very peaceful fellow.
I always had to argue with them. Katati, for instance. Moniz and I were 2 black hat people in Southern California, and we were not popular up in Northern California. We thought they were sort of wusses. And
well, that went on with the midget racing too.
Did it?
I mean,
Same
we
thing.
were outlaws if we went to Northern California with midgets.
well, that's what we were.
Yeah.
We were running a race up at maybe Katati, and I'm behind Moniz, and I keep seeing the corner men get down like this. Well, that alerts a driver that there's something wrong underneath your car and that the corner man sees it. Well, I could see there wasn't anything wrong, so I got up finally alongside Frank, and I gave him the sign here. So the next time he came around, he gave him the proverbial finger. So they black flagged him in. I won the race by default. And the other Northern California people weren't anywhere as near us. So at the end of the race, I pulled in, and we're up at the start and finish line, and the officials there raising Cain with Frank. And I walked up to it, and I said, Frank, you're dead wrong. I said, you never up here give your finger to him. You up here, you stick your tongue out at him. And they threw me out, too. So we were not too popular up there.
Well, there was some, just things that went on that was so great with everybody in those days.
Laguna Seca, the same thing.
Yeah.
I ran third behind, we were running for money at the time. And I was running third behind, and there was a Ferrari running fourth. He was from New York, and he desperately wanted the points, but I beat him. So after the race, they disqualified me for pulling into the pits. Well, I didn't pull into the pits. And Gus Vigneault, he used to write the paper for Competition Press, maybe, a forerunner of one of our magazines, and Gus just got all over him. And so at the next victory party, I wore a black hat, and I went in and I said, I realize that you think I'm the black hat guy up here, but if I get the money, I want the points too. And we won out because that was. Oh, let me tell you about Peter Revson and Carol Shelby. I had a dental office. Carol Shelby owned the building. We're across the hall from each other. So we trade quips back and forth all the time. And one day I had this girl come in, a patient came in. Her name was Betty something. And she was something else. I think she was a working girl. And she had this leather vest on with the strings across here and nothing else underneath it. And I said, Betty, do me a favor. She says, what's that? I said, go in my back office back there and strip off, and I'll send somebody back there, which she did. So I went across the hall, and here's Shelby in his office with Peter Revson. I said, why don't you guys go in my back office? I want to show you something interesting. So they come in the front door, and they go back there, and pretty soon I can hear the whooping and yelling and screaming. And Shelby's all over the place, and it was a fun time. But if you can't have fun out of this whole thing, you shouldn't be doing it.
Well,
and not take it too seriously.
Speaking of Shelby, we were there. Talk about the history programs on television and everything. All of us were there the day Carol Shelby brought a little silver roadster. I think, now wasn't it Riverside? Yes. Santa Barbara. Cute little silver roadster made in England that he had stuffed a big hairy Ford in it. And we think, hey, that's great. Boy, what a car. And did it go? It really moved because of aluminum body and everything. And he said, yeah, I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to, what I plan on, I thought I'd make maybe some of these, and I'm going to call them, I think I'm going to call them a Cobra. So we don't need to say any more about that. You know where that went. On and more, and duplicates and copies and Carol Shelby. But in those days, we were all just guys. It didn't make any difference whether you ran class H, G, B modified. You were all racers. And that was the glory of it. We were the beginning. We were like World War I fighter pilots. But if you ran out of ammunition, you waved at the guy. But I was in it for the sport. I was never in it to knock this guy out or drive this guy. It was just the fun of it. So that's why I was into the sports cars and then the racing, and then later on motorcycles, went through that phase. And then finally, after I'd given up everything, then I got involved in dirt track midgets. And for 3 years, when I was only 65 then, I was racing dirt track midgets at Ventura and Placerville and Grass Valley and Sacramento. And I tell you, when you go out to one of those dirt tracks and they're all in the stands with those lights coming down and the lights are flickering and that truck gets behind you and you have only an in and out box, no gear shift, you just lock it in gear. I saw what they meant by race cars. And each phase is different. From you go to our sports cars, which they're still running up at Laguna Seca, and Formula One and kart and all of those. But midget racing is a life of its own. You're in a four-wheel motorcycle going sideways at 80 miles an hour, and there's no starters, no gauges to speak of, just heat and oil. And a truck gets behind you, and the engine is off, and it pushes you, go thug, 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 and you get going, it beeps its horn, and you light it. You hit the starter switch, and it fires, and it jams you in the back of the seat, and you're out into that dirt, riding like a rock. And all these people are yelling and screaming and everything, and you all line up 2 by 2 to come around. That's an experience. So I'm glad I'm alive, still enjoying all of this. So, but we've all had great experiences.
But
Bill,
I knew when it was over from our day. In our day,
Yeah.
Your toolbox was open. If you didn't have a certain wrench, you go over to that one over there and you take it, use it, put it back.
Yeah.
And if I had a fuel pump, an extra fuel pump, and you needed it, I want you in the race. You're my competitor, but I want you in that race because a hollow victory isn't worth anything. It's hollow. We traded parts back and forth. At Riverside, I was driving for Mickey Thompson, one of the big cars, and I'm in the pits at Riverside under the buildings, and next to me was Parnelli Jones, if I should mention him, but that's when I knew that our day was over. I needed some air in the tire. Well, I hated to take the car and drag it clear over to the Union place there to get the air in it, so I asked Parnelli if I could borrow his tire pump. And he said, "Did you come to race or to borrow tools?" And so I gave him the finger sign and pushed the car over. And I was more than a little bit irritated, but I didn't hit him. Didn't do that. He's a lot smaller than I am.
Well, same kind of thing. We were at the Sacramento Mile for a big event. You know, they were running the Silver Crown cars or something. So the big names were there. But for our race, you all had to be at the driver's meeting. Well, as I say, you had no gear shift. If you wanted to change gears, higher gear, you jacked it up, got under the car to the quick change box, and you took the back of the plate off and you put different gears in there, and then you put the plate on. So I was under there and my wife was over there. You have no pit crew. You know, this is fun racing. And I'm trying to do that, and they're calling for the driver's meeting. Well, if you don't get to the driver's meeting, you don't race. So these guys in the black shirts with a number on it, they were standing there and said, "Hey, will you go on to the driver's meeting? We'll fix it. We'll put the gear in. Go ahead. So okay. Was A.J. Foyt's pit crew for his big Silver Crown car. So it shows the kind of people that this sport had. You would go over and help the other guys all you could, or they would come and help you, or you would push their cars, they would push yours. You know, it was great camaraderie, and I think it still is. When you get up to Laguna Seca and everything, even though now it's a different game with quadruples of billions and millions of dollars, it's still a camaraderie.
I should tell you about Eugene, Oregon, too. That was a good one. I was having a friend fly to Eugene, Oregon.
I never went up there.
The track was at a place called Newport, which is out on the coast about 50 miles from Eugene. Well, the airport's at Eugene. So I had a friend fly to San Francisco and then was flying into Eugene. And so here we are, about 5 of us in the cars, 5 different cars, and we're in the trailers. So I pull into this little podunk airport in there, so I walked into the office. I was actually waiting for the plane to come in. And I said, "Well, okay." I said, "Well, we've got the people out there, and their hay bales are all out there on the runway, so that's good. We're going to have the race." And the guy gets all upset. He says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, we're having a race here tomorrow." So I've got the people out there putting the hay bales out to mark the course on the thing. He says, "You can't do that. We've got an airplane coming in." I said, "Well, they're going to have to divert it then because all these hay bales are out there." And it caused a great sensation there for a while. Finally, the plane came in. Of course, there weren't any hay bales. But if you can't, as I say, if you can't have a laugh out of it,
There's a name that we should bring up, and unfortunately, he won't be talking to you because he's not with us anymore. It's Max Belichowski. See, guys with money, the Allards, okay, they were not terribly expensive, and you could buy them and put the engine in, but they were bringing over Ferraris and Maseratis, and the guys now with money, they're getting serious. Well, I mentioned that Max and the guys, they were old hot rodders from the 30s. So Max builds his own cars, and he built the Old Yellers. What are there? 6 of them, I think, now, but we remember Old Yeller number 1.
well, Walker, there's 15 remaining out of the original 6.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, like the original Cobras. There are several thousand original Cobras. But Max would build these cars the way they used to. He'd go get a chassis and widen it or shorten it, and Buicks, and he would use a big Buick engine, and they were not aesthetically gorgeous. Somehow, he and his wife, I went to his shop once, what, Santa Monica or Hollywood Boulevard?
Hollywood.
Santa Monica Boulevard?
Hollywood,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, Hollywood Boulevard, yeah. And you go in the back, and pair of legs sticking out, look like a 12-year-old boy or so, and you hear the crackling and the sparkling, and somebody's welding, and he slides out, takes the helmet off, and it's his wife. She's under there welding and building these cars. And he built the Old Yeller Buicks. Now, to test them, like 1 o'clock in the morning back in the 50s, there was no traffic. So you'd drive down Hollywood Boulevard to Western, and you'd turn left, and you'd sit there. And as you go up Western, there's a big curve. You go up a hill, and you turn right onto Franklin. And that's where he used to test for acceleration and everything, and he would test these Buicks. And in one of the instances, I'm trying to think who it was, but he was virtually a lap ahead of the Ferrari in Old Yeller. He had almost going to lap him in the Ferrari. But this upset the entire sports car field. Then you had Morganson, or the guys from San Francisco, and a lot of people started building specials with Jaguar engines and everything, but you can find those in your local magazines. But Max Belichowski, it's too bad he isn't here to tell us some of his wonderful stories. And we'd go to these great dinners, and he'd have on his jumpsuit, and he's just an average, regular Joe, no glory, no nothing. But he would stand in the same row with Carroll Shelby and all those guys as the great history of our sport in building those cars.
Yeah. And I was going to tell you a little bit about Mickey Thompson, having driven for him a bit.
Yeah.
He selected, at that time, there were very few front-wheel drive cars, and few front-wheel drivers. So he had this car to go to the Speedway in Annapolis. So he wanted me to drive it. So Jerry and I said, okay, we'll do that. So we went to the Speedway.
The one with the little wheels,
Yeah,
the
little
10-inch
tennis wheels.
Yeah.
So we went to the Speedway and trying to qualify it. I couldn't get it up to speed. And Mickey wanted to lock up the differential. Well, in a front-wheel drive, you can't do that, because in a front-wheel drive, when you apply power, it pulls you around the corner. And I said, if we do that, and I apply power, we're gonna go in that wall. And Mickey argued and argued about it, and so finally Jerry and I got up to 160, 70, somewhere in there, not quite enough to qualify or enough time, but he wanted to get better than that out of it, and Jerry and I said, that's enough of that. And we walked off and broke the contract, and he wanted to sue us. But an interesting thing about Mickey was that in his house he had this enormous cougar, about 6 or 7 or 8 feet long, mounted on a stone up against the wall. Well, I knew his family a bit, and they wanted, after Mickey was killed, they wanted to sell the house, but people would come in and see that cougar mounted up there, and it's a vicious looking cat, really like that. and good-looking cat. I don't kill things. And here he had killed this cat, and it was mounted up there, so they said people would object to it, and you can't give them away or sell them because of endangered species, so they were going to have to burn it. And so I said, fine, I'll take it and burn it for you. You don't need to do it. It's mounted in my living room now. It's the greatest thing
And it
you've
is
ever seen.
gorgeous. I mean, it's so beautifully done. So
My cats love it.
yeah. But this car he's talking about, it was so radically different. And there's not that many pictures of it, but it looked like a skateboard. I mean, it was so flat. Yeah, little 10-inch wheels, and it looked like it was in the wrong race.
Yeah.
I mean, here's all these Indy cars, until the Coopers came over, they were smaller, but this car was really strange. And then,
Well, I could get it up
then
to
there was
speed.
Dave McDonald's routine, too, with Mickey Thompson.
Yeah.
So that's a different story.
Dave wrecked the car, because he took the ride after me and wrecked the car in practice,
Yeah.
and so he quit Mickey, too. Mickey was not one of the nicer people in the world. Sorry to say, somebody didn't like him a lot more.
Well, he was a nice guy when you're just around.
Yeah.
I mean,
He
just
was
at the
okay.
gatherings and everything, he was great, it's just, but he had little quirks like some of us do. So, anyway, that covers a lot of our history, for what it's worth, and I know you're awfully excited to hear much more, but
should
I
tell you
don't
a
think there
little
is
bit
much more.
about Alan Fordney. Alan Fordney was our race announcer.
Yes, he's been in
Well,
several movies.
yes,
You
didn't
saw him in several of the
Well, he
black
did,
and white early race movies.
Yeah, he did Le Mans,
Yeah.
and that he was the announcer in that. He was our announcer for a long
Yeah.
time. Anyway, I was going to make him a partial denture. So I flew my airplane up to Oxnard Airport and landed, because I needed an impression. I had to retake an impression. He'd been in the office, but I needed a new impression. So we go in the restroom, and I mix up the stuff, and he gets down on his knees in front of me, you see, and I've got my fingers in his mouth, and he's got his knees down on the ground in front of me, and the cop walks in. Oh, geez, the cop thinks he's really got a winner here. But we got out of that one, okay? But it was a funny scene to see these two perverts in the restroom.
Yeah,
that
race
was fun.
people are fun people. So,
And then I drove the Formula One car for Renault Pellandini.
Oh,
remember?
yeah.
Pellandini was
Yeah.
and he had this
Yeah.
Formula One car, and he wanted me to drive it, so I ran it for several. Oh, that was a good thing. I dumped it at Hourglass Field, and up on the side. Well, at the I dumped my car first. In the
Hourglass Field. Where was Hourglass?
San Diego.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I dumped I hit a hay bale, went up on the side. Got a big gash in my head, and I'm upside down, and the crash crew comes up, and they pull the car out, and they pull me out, and they see all this blood, and they pull my helmet off. Well, my toupee comes off, and I got blood all over it, and the medics pass out. One of them does. He throws up and passes out because he thought my skull had come off. But again, that was worth it. But the next day I was wounded, but I drove Renee's car that next day. I should tell you about Vi Jones. A friend of mine is one of the world's greatest illustrators. Airplanes, ships, boats, and so forth. And he painted a great picture of my Panhard going through a turn, leading Harry Jones. Harry Jones was a great driver, but he was a sour, miserable person. He was not much fun, but he had a beautiful car. He had a Lotus 11 Club, and his mechanic made the finest Crosley engine I've ever seen in my life. I could never beat him fair and square.
Well, it was pretty.
It was pretty.
Wasn't that
Yeah.
fast?
So,
Not as fast as mine.
And
It was pretty to look at.
Yeah. But it shows in the background Harry hitting the hay bale and me leading it. With Panhard runs with 3 wheels because you always lift one wheel like a dog. It lifts a wheel. And it's so Ted Davis wanted to hang it behind the bar in the Grand Prix restaurant. Grand Prix was a restaurant where most of us hung out and told dirty stories and so forth in those days. And as we got in there, here comes Vi Jones, Harry's wife, and Harry. And she saw that picture once, and she slapped me so hard I thought I was going to see stars, and she about knocked my head off. The insult of this. So everybody grabbed her. But I still have the picture.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous
This
picture.
guy did all the Revell kits and
Yeah.
everything, so it was wonderful.
Yeah.
But, oh yeah, as you think back, and you think of things, the more you talk, the more things you
Yeah.
think of. But I remember with that Crosley that beat Perry Perron, I won the Index of Performance, the 750 race at the very first Riverside Grand Prix race they ever had, and we just lost a light. But anyway, we'll see the light later. One of the great things, I had a TV show at the time, and they told me they were building a new track over in Riverside, a new raceway track, and I said, oh, that's great. Send me an invitation. So one of my claims to fame, I am the very first entry ever received for the Riverside Grand Prix racetrack. So that's one of my claims to fame. But we were just the guys who raced. Never the great big names that you looked up to, but we were the guys that people watched and
Made
put
lots
on
of
a show.
mistakes. Lots of
Yeah,
mistakes.
didn't do it for money. Cost us a lot of money, but we loved it. And there's just something about racing that grabs you. And now everybody is so concerned about multi-million-dollar this and $1 million that, and you got to have this and you got to have that. We just kind of got by, bought our own stuff, hauled our own cars up there. Usually your wife was your pit crew or a couple of friends that went with you. So it was a great experience. And these were not the classics then. These were 1950, early 50s, early 60s. And it was a great experience.
Well, going through that, I was still working my way through. I was still in the Navy and finally made Rear Admiral and worked my ship and so forth in between. And I found that command of a ship is one of the loneliest billets in the Navy because you are alone. You're all on your own. Racing is much like that. When once that flag drops, you're out there, you're on your own. And it's a lonely, lonely place out there. There's no friends after the flag drops.
But the thing is, too, you don't have to be a great athlete. You don't have to play football and baseball and everything. A easygoing, good-natured guy. Ken Miles was the sweetest man you'd ever want to meet. He had a voice kind of like that. Oh, hello, good morning. It's awfully nice day for the race, isn't it? And he's gentle. Put him in a race car and look out. I mean, he raced Le Mans. He raced all the great races. He was a champion, but just a sweet, gentle person. So that's another thing about racing. You didn't have to be a big, husky bruiser to do it, because I wasn't. Hey, Bill.
Hey,
What's up?
nothing special. I think we're probably pretty close to the end of the tape, aren't we, cameraman? Great times, really great
Yeah.
times.
And one of the great things, this guy, he's pretty good himself in the Allards. He beat the greatest cars that were around at the time. And at Laguna Seca once, they had Allard Day. We had 74 Allards or so, and I have an L-type four-seater. And I got to drive behind Boll Pollack all through the turns in the parade at 40 miles an hour.
That's about as fast as I want to go right now.
Yeah.
But they were fun cars.
Yeah. Oh.
We
Yeah.
didn't know any better, really.
Yeah, I still have the four-seater Allard with the cat engine in it. So, but anyway, I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Walker.
I hope
Thank
we
you,
found
Bill.
something
We
interesting.
appreciate
Yeah.
it. Pardon me. So we'll wrap that up then. Thank you very much.